Denver Catholic Register, January 26, 1950. Time may be later than we think. Come with us to a disquieting Denver meeting. By Register staff writer. If you are laboring under the impression that it cannot happen here, catch the show at the CRC Center in Denver some night. The entertainment will keep you on the rim of your seat, and the effect on your thinking will be the same as if someone had planted a vest pocket A-bomb in the pit of your complacency. The CRC building, located slightly off dead center in Denver's Five Points area, is of course the Denver affiliate of the National Civil Rights Congress, the outfit that helped bail out Gerhard Eisler and posted bond for the 11 communists recently convicted in New York, and which was termed subversive and communist by Justice Tom Clark when he was Attorney General. The Congressional Committee on Un-American Activities pegged it as, quote, dedicated not to the broader issue of civil liberties, but specifically to the defense of individual communists and the Communist Party, and, quote, controlled by individuals who are either members of the Communist Party or openly loyal to it. A recent Wednesday night's entertainment at the CRC was quite superior. In addition to a full slate of local talent, the bill featured a big bitter and egg man. Get 'em bitter, then egg 'em on. From the state of Washington, namely Dr. Herbert J. Phillips, until recently a philosophy professor at the University of Washington and an avowed and admittedly very active Communist Party member since 1935. Things got moving down at 2540 Washington Street at about 8 p.m. with a guard, complete with bulldog Drummond trench coat, turned-up collar, cigarette, and slouch hat as though he were on loan from the Dick Tracy comic strip. Pacing back and forth out in front, seemingly expecting a flying attack at any minute from a phalanx of Notre Dame lettermen or a goon squad of phalangists sent special delivery by Francisco Franco. Inside, things were getting warm. The place, a scrubby room with dimensions similar to those of a whistle-stop railway depot, was packed. In the audience, which, unfortunately enough, was composed of large delegations of Negroes and Spanish-American people, as well as a fair share of those boasting other ethnic origins, were a few familiar faces. Harold Zeppelin, of so many red affiliations, Tracy Rogers, several times a candidate for public office on the communist ticket, Shirley Wellinger of the National Association of Mexican Americans, and Charles Duke McKenna, formerly of the Mine Mill and Smelter Workers Union, and now head of the local Civil Rights Congress chapter, and host for the evening as well. The rest of the crowd was indeed a crosscut. Included on the one hand were heavy-haired intellectuals with deep glasses and bizarre get-ups, and on the other, poorly dressed proles with self-hacked haircuts. We were quite a heterogeneous group. Jane Rogers was talking. A former Denver Communist Party treasurer and one of the Denver Six, recently convicted of contempt in a decision handed down by the U.S. District Court. She is the wife of Tracy Rogers and a more innocent-appearing person you have never seen, unless it be Dr. Phillips, but more about him in a minute. Rather miscast as a rebel, Mrs. Rogers sing-songs her grievances as though she were giving out with a gold medal kitchen-tested recipe. For her part, as she retailed in a nervous voice, she is a victim of the justice system that we have in the United States. She was not very convincing, but the next speaker was. This was Samuel Menin, the man who defends the local commies whenever an investigation is undertaken to see whether they have strayed outside the pale of the law. Mr. Menon spoke at length of the local contempt trials, took a few cracks at retired Judge J. Foster Symes, got a round of laughs by calling government attorney Max H. Goldsheim Mr. Goldswine, and finally scored heavily with the partisan crowd by labeling Justice Tom Clark as, quote, the arch enemy of civil rights. Dr. Phillips followed the shrewd Mr. Menon, and it was here that the program shifted into high gear. In appearance, Dr. Phillips is a hayseed. Mentally, he most certainly is not. He looks like the typical down east Cracker Barrel sage. He even has a sprig of hair blooming in back to match the cowlick out front. But without a doubt, under that hay hair, there throbs an ever-thinking brain. This man is smooth. Like the other speakers, he knelt briefly at Mrs. Rogers' shrine, she being the martyr of the evening. Then he placed his hand on her shoulder, said that he felt humble because he had never been jailed for the cause, and called her comrade. Then followed a not very brief review of his own case. He was one of 3 University of Washington professors dismissed for political beliefs and activities, after which he told of trying to testify in the New York Communist trial and of speaking on the same platforms with relatives of the Trenton Six, and later with the famous Hollywood 10. After this, by way of explaining how he had remained in the party for 15 years out of sheer appreciation of its limitless virtues, he got a good ovation by disavowing being bought off with Moscow gold, got a better response by wondering aloud how communism remains so popular when the party does not run any, quote, communist parochial schools, and brought down the house by archly asking how the party could do so well without holding threats of after-death sanctions over the heads of its adherents. He moved to answer this question by asking another. "What is all this talk about following the party line?" he asked, and then went on to explain that certainly they all knew the reasoning behind the philosophy that called for certain rather abrupt twists and turns in communist logic, and that it was this reasoning that American communists like. He denied the presence of Moscow influence, only to reverse course again by saying that the only reason communists seem to follow the line is that they appreciate the superior brand of thinking emanating from Moscow. He also denied being an old fogey professor who had absent-mindedly signed some card. He said that he was, and had been for 15 years, an active communist. Following this, everyone, through the courtesy of Dr. Phillips, enjoyed a few moments of deep emotion over the glorious successes in China. The feeling pervaded that somehow prosperity for the communists was just around the corner. Dr. Phillips carefully fed this fancy. After this, he pointed with pride to the defeat in Illinois and Minnesota of laws restricting party activities, and he positively glowed over the wonderful new democracies in Eastern Europe. At this point, he reached his climax. "The people all over the world are moving," he said, cocking his head and listening. There was a tension-filled silence. "The people all over the world are moving," he said, again, reverently. Everything was very tense. In fact, not one of us moved. "Say that sentence to yourselves 10 times before breakfast every morning," he admonished. Following Dr. Phillips, who for some reason was invited to speak before various groups at both the University of Colorado and Denver University during recent visits, Mrs. Maya James Scherer, head of the Civil Rights Congress office in Pueblo, and no mean actress took the floor. A small, youngish, rather attractive woman, she told in a tremulous voice of the Pueblo chapter's fight for minority rights. She threw back her head and shoulders, her little fists clenched in anger. She cried just a little, and then, finally, she broke down in an impassioned plea for more money for the people's fight. At this point, several ushers appeared from nowhere and took up the collection while Mrs. Scherer put the dun on the audience in approved auctioneer style. "Look at the color of these walls," she said. "Green! That is what we need. Green! Do I hear 10? How about 5? 1, maybe? All right, if you cannot afford anything larger, give us your change." Following this, and after a short question session conducted by Dr. Phillips, everyone went home, most having decided that things were looking up for the cause, while a couple of us wondered if it is not, perhaps, as the legend on the sundial reads, a little later than we think.
Among my sources for this season is one of the first book-length accounts written on the 1913-1914 strike, Out of the Depths, from 1943, by Colorado journalist Baran Bishower. If you search by title on Google Books for a full digital scan of Out of the Depths, you will not find it, which makes sense. It won't be in the public domain in the U.S. until 2039. But a full digital scan of Out of the Depths does clandestinely exist on Google Books. It's appended, for some reason, upside down, at the end of another seemingly unrelated text, an 1873 book called An Essay Toward an Indian Bibliography by Thomas Warren Field, a New York educator, author, and florist. The word essay in the title of Field's book should be taken in its archaic sense as regarding an attempt. It presents no argument or thesis. It is literally just a list of books in Field's personal library pertaining to Indigenous and Aboriginal studies, with some notes and details on select listings. In the preface to the book, Fields apologizes. He intended to publish a more comprehensive and useful book, but it was just too hard a task. I find this relatable. Field also wrote a volume on the Battle of Long Island and a treatise on the cultivation of pear trees, neither of which, it was noted in his obituary, had much circulation. Among the papers of Edgar Allan Poe is the following letter to Thomas Field from August 9, 1845. Dear Sir, it is nearly a month since I received a note from you requesting an interview, but by some inadvertence I placed it, your note, among my pile of answered letters. This will account to you for my seeming discourtesy in not sooner giving you an answer. I have now to say that I shall be happy to see you at any time at my residence, 195 East Broadway. You will generally find me at home in the morning before 10. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Edgar A. Poe. I'm not sure that anyone has taken the time to speculate on what the subject of Poe's interview with Field might have been, or if it in fact ever took place, and I'm not very well equipped to do so now. Field would have been a young Williamsburg schoolteacher at the time, recently migrated from Onondaga Hill upstate. Poe is nearing the end of his short life, already the famous author of The Purloined Letter, The Raven, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Pit and the Pendulum, and dozens of other works. Perhaps it had something to do with Poe's position as editor of the Broadway Journal, which he was now only a half a year from completely running into the ground. In any case, thanks to this letter from Poe, someone at the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore was inspired to preserve for our appreciation some additional biographical facts about Thomas Warren Field. He was married 4 times, first to Charlotte, then upon her untimely death to Helen Tuttle, who herself was killed in a train accident so soon after the wedding ceremony that Field was unable to collect any damages because they hadn't even had time to legally consummate the marriage. His subsequent marriage to Emmeline Van Sicklen endured happily enough until Field discovered her affair, scandalous at the time, with Thomas Kinsella, editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the paper which would later run the obituary of Field I just quoted from, 3 years after Field's final marriage to Alice, who was wife number 4. Circulation numbers notwithstanding, Field's book on the Battle of Long Island from 1869 continues to influence the behavior of people striding the earth today, even as you and I have this pleasant, if a bit one-sided, conversation. The Battle of Long Island, more commonly known today as the Battle of Brooklyn, was the first battle of the American Revolution to take place after the Declaration of Independence. In early summer 1776, in response to the publishing of the Declaration, the British began building the largest fleet ever assembled up to that time in Nova Scotia, over 400 ships carrying 35,000 soldiers and sailors, with which they hoped to smother the American Revolution in its cradle by wiping out the Continental Army garrisoned at New York City. The battle, fought over 3 days in late August, was a decisive victory for the British, but the Continentals were able to safely withdraw most of their troops across the East River to Manhattan, beginning the long retreat that culminated in the famous crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776. In his book on the Battle of Brooklyn, Thomas Field introduced into the historical canon the matter of a supposed mass grave of 250 soldiers from a Maryland battalion known today as the Maryland 400, which is an undercount by at least half, since the Maryland battalion in question comprised as many as 1,000 soldiers. In the now standard telling, the Maryland 400 made a brave stand against Hessian mercenaries to ensure the safe evacuation of the Continental Army. It's probably true that this battalion helped provide cover for a retreat across the Gowanus marshes, but they would probably have been in small units scattered across the sprawling battlefield, not fighting in a single formation. The anthropologist William J. Perry estimates that the total number of Marylanders killed was closer to 25 than to 250, with the rest of the soldiers listed as lost in battle probably taken prisoner or perhaps drowned in the swamp during the hasty retreat. A contemporary source wrote in September 1776, "The Maryland battalion has lost 259 men. Who of them are killed and who prisoners is yet uncertain." As for the mass grave story, this appears to be a lazy interpolation on Field's part of various local family legends and anecdotes. Nevertheless, it was taken as given by subsequent historians, and it is embraced as fact by many lay historians today, who are united in their enchantment at the prospect of one day finding the resting place of a mythical early American regiment. Just a decade ago, the New York Times called the undiscovered grave, quote, "the archaeological equivalent of El Dorado." For many years, the site of the grave was believed to lie beneath a coal yard in Gowanus owned by a dealer named Henry Wildhack. Wildhack himself was a big booster of the mass grave story, and he tried to persuade the city to erect a memorial on his property, which he naturally hoped to sell to them at a reasonable price. Wildhack Coal and Coke went out of business in 1931 and was replaced by a Red Devil paint factory. An archaeological dig was performed there in 1957, and when nothing was found, new theories of the grave's location sprung up. Further explorations were conducted in 1998 and 2017, finding nothing, but faith in that hidden tomb of heroes lives on. Today, you can read on Wikipedia that the site is now believed to be under an auto repair shop in Park Slope. Citation needed. There was a bill in the 2021 session of the New York Assembly to establish in Brooklyn a green space called Marylanders Green to commemorate the slaughter and mass burial of an entire battalion, almost 250 years after it didn't happen. That's roughly 1 year for every soldier who wasn't buried there. History is a marketing tool, Julian Barnes once wrote. No, it's worse than that. What he actually wrote was, history is at best a marketing tool. At best. That's dark. Admittedly, it does seem to help somehow to imagine that the bones of some war heroes are spending eternity together in a little mini Valhalla under a Park Slope parking lot. In the same way that it helps to imagine that Paul Bunyan's ox was blue, or that Davy Crockett killed a bar when he was only 3. In episode 4 of this podcast, I mentioned that all the original eyewitnesses to the 7th Street Massacre in Walsenburg in October 1913 agreed that nobody from the crowd fired a shot until after the deputies started shooting at them. I might have given the impression that these eyewitnesses testified under oath. They did not. The eyewitness interviews were conducted by Ed Doyle, Secretary-Treasurer of District 15, and presented to the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations when they came to Colorado to collect evidence in late 1914. The eyewitnesses weren't sworn or cross-examined. The testimony gives every impression of being sincere, and the questions don't appear to be too leading, but as documentary evidence, they're hardly airtight. The 7th Street Massacre isn't well known enough to have passed into folklore, but the Ludlow Massacre certainly was, and much like the tale of the Maryland 400, the folkloric version is much transformed. Here are some things that didn't happen during the Ludlow Massacre. Quote, Louis Tikas was riddled with 85 bullets fired point blank as he tried to protect the children underground in the cave below the tent. That's from Meridel Lassuer's 1991 novel, Dread Road, describing a martyrdom that never happened, though the last minutes and hours of Louis Tikas' life, which we'll soon be discussing, were not much less dramatic. Here's another. That very night your soldiers waited until all us miners were asleep. You snuck around our little tent town, soaked our tents with your kerosene. You struck a match, and in the blaze that started, you pulled the triggers of your Gatling guns. I made a run for the children, but the firewall stopped me. 13 children died from your guns. That's from Woody Guthrie's 1944 song, The Ludlow Massacre. It could almost be describing the Bull Moose Special's attack on the Holly Grove tent colony in West Virginia in February 1913, which happened at night when everyone was asleep, but no children were killed in that attack, thankfully. 13 children did perish at Ludlow on April 30th, but not from gunfire, with the exception of poor Frank Snyder, age 11, who caught a bullet to the head during what his family had thought was a break in the shooting. Perhaps I should mention that that's one of 2 accounts of Frank's death, and I'm not totally sure it's the right one. In the other version, he alone emerged from the pit below his family's tent in order to get his mother a drink of water. One song about Ludlow even put John D. Rockefeller's finger on the trigger, though the intent is so obviously metaphorical that it doesn't seem to have become part of the lore. John D., he was a Christian, the song goes. John D., the psalms he sung. But he'd no mercy in his heart, he shot down old and young. One night when all were sleeping, all wrapped up in their dreams, we heard a loud explosion. We heard most terrible screams. Oh, save us from the burning flames, we heard our children cry, but John D. laughed and shot them down right there before our eyes. These lyrics are by Alfred Hayes, a novelist and screenwriter who also wrote the words to the far superior song, I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night. Anyway, that's all I have on Thomas Field, at least for now. So let's return to the upside-down copy of Out of the Depths that is appended, for some reason, to the Google Books scan of Fields' bibliography. On the half-title page of this book appears this handwritten inscription to an unknown addressee. Regards, Rudy Cook, Colorado Progressive Party. Numerous parties in American politics over the years have gone under the name Progressive. In the 19-teens, there was Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Progressive Party, of course, a sort of proto-social democratic party with imperialist tendencies. A decade later, in 1924, Fighting Bob La Follett's Progressive Party called for nationalization of the railroads, utilities, timber, coal, oil, and iron ore, debt relief for farmers, reduction in military spending, strengthening the right to collective bargaining, and the end of judicial review. A quarter century later, in 1948, Henry Wallace, FDR's erstwhile vice president, established a party by that same name to challenge Harry Truman from the left in the presidential election. Wallace's platform called for expansion of the New Deal, the eradication of Jim Crow, a women's rights amendment, and nationalization of the energy sector. This is the Progressive Party that Rudolph Cook was briefly affiliated with in Colorado, serving as executive secretary during the 1948 campaign, in between jobs in various labor organizations. By 1950, a few years after Cook signed that copy of Out of the Depths for an unknown recipient, we find him working for the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, Mine Mill for short. As we touched on in episode 5, until 1916, Mine Mill went by a name you've heard before, the Western Federation of Miners, or WFM. In 1935, Mine Mill was one of the first member unions of the new Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. 15 years later, they would be expelled from the CIO for, quote, communist domination. I haven't been able to verify that Rudy Cook was himself a Communist Party member. Many who were accused as such under oath were not. But according to an FBI informant named Bellarmino Joe Duran, who was recruited to infiltrate the West Side Mexican branch of the Colorado Communist Party, he most certainly was. In 1956, Duran appeared before the House Committee on Un-American Activities to relate some of the things he had learned in 5 years as a snitch and to, boy oh boy, name names, 58 names in all, including the entire cast of the 1954 film Salt of the Earth, which Mine Mill had sponsored. Duran testified about secret schools, study groups, and front organizations, attendance at closed party meetings, party cell structure, outreach efforts, and strategic aspirations for gaining future political power in Colorado. About Rudy Cook, he had comparatively little to say, but it was damning enough for the Committee on Un-American Activities to order a subpoena. Duran testified that Cook attended a closed party meeting at 1421 Mariposa in Denver in 1951. The day after Duran's testimony, Cook was called as a witness before the committee. His interrogator was Richard Ahrens, director and counsel for the House Committee for Un-American Activities from 1954 to 1960, who would interrogate such famous witnesses as Paul Robeson, Judy Holliday, and Arthur Miller. Before that, he had been an aide to Senator Joe McCarthy. In speeches, Ahrens liked to claim that there were between 3 to 5 million illegal immigrants in the United States, all with communist leanings, many with communist criminal backgrounds, and furthermore that the House Committee knew for a fact that there were 9 million communist agents in Africa, and that several African witch doctors had been sent to Moscow for special training, then returned home to further the communist conspiracy. Like so many anti-communists, Ahrens was a fanatical white supremacist. In 1960, he would be forced to resign from the House Committee when it was revealed that he had been on the payroll of the wealthy Nazi sympathizer Wycliffe Draper, consulting for Draper's infamous Pioneer Fund, which was and is dedicated to demonstrating not just the genetic inferiority of dark-skinned people, but of the futility of light-skinned people attempting to coexist with them in a civilized society. One of the Pioneer Fund's early initiatives in the 1930s was funding screenings in U.S. schools of a Nazi propaganda film about eugenics. 2 decades later, the Pioneer Fund tasked Ahrens with finding geneticists who were willing to support Draper's racial inferiority theories and to secure funding for their research. Draper is long dead, but the Pioneer Fund lives on, funding promoters of race science such as Arthur Jensen, Roger Pearson, Hans Eysenck, William Shockley, and Richard Lynn. Not household names exactly, but they are each cited by America's leading popularizer of race realism, Charles Murray, in his infamous 1994 book, The Bell Curve. I'd like to read to you now Rudy Cook's testimony from the Congressional Record. When you hear me read the interruptions by the chairman, that's Congressman Francis E. Walter, who also served as an officer of the Pioneer Fund throughout the 1950s and 60s. Ahrens. Mr. Cook, look over here to your left. Will you please stand up, Mr. Duran? Look this man in the face, please, sir, and tell us whether you have ever seen him before. Cook. I've seen his picture. Ahrens. Where did you see his picture? Cook. Under the heading of Government Stool Pigeon in the paper. Chairman. You never saw that in the paper at all. Cook. That is my interpretation. Chairman. You would be very proud if someone would put that title on your name if you had done what this man has done. Ahrens. Perhaps you saw his picture in the Mine Mill paper. Is that where you mean? Cook. I saw it in the paper yesterday. Aarons. What paper was it? Cook. The Post, Denver Post. Aarons. Did you see stool pigeon under his name? Cook. Maybe I... Chairman. Did you see stool pigeon? Cook. No. Chairman. You know you were under oath, don't you? Cook. Yes, sir. Chairman. When you said you saw his name with stool pigeon under it, you knew you were lying, didn't you? Cook. I think maybe the word was informer. Chairman. All right. Cook. I may have used the wrong name. Aarons. Is that the only place you have seen this gentleman's picture? Cook. I decline to answer the question under my privilege under the Fifth Amendment. Aarons. Do you regard him as a stool pigeon? Cook. I decline to answer the question on the same basis. Aarons. This man served his country for several years as an undercover agent in the communist conspiracy, which is designed to overthrow this government by force and violence, designed to create political subversion in this nation, designed to poison the minds of the people with a treacherous philosophy of life. In the course of that service, he testified under oath before this committee that he knew you as a member of that treacherous conspiracy and as a member of the Communist Party. Look this man in the face now in front of these people before this committee and tell us whether or not he was lying or telling the truth. Cook. I would say that the matter of his lying is strictly between him and the good Lord. Aarons. Is that your answer to my question? Cook. As far as the question goes, I will answer it by declining to answer on the basis of my privilege. Aarons. Was he lying when he said under oath before Almighty God that he knew you as a member of the communist conspiracy? Cook. I decline to answer the question under my privilege under the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Aarons. Are you presently a member of the Communist Party? Cook. I decline to answer that question under the same privilege. Aarons. Are you presently a member and operator of this treacherous conspiracy? Cook. I decline to answer the question under my privilege under the United States Constitution, the Fifth Amendment. Aarons. Do you honestly apprehend that if you gave a truthful answer as to whether or not you've ever seen this man before, Mr. Duran, you'd be supplying information which might be used against you in a criminal proceeding? Cook. Could you put that in working man's language? Aarons. Let's just start over again. Have you ever seen this man, Mr. Duran, before? Cook. I decline to answer the question under my privilege under the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Aarons. Why? Cook. I decline to answer the question. Aarons. I suggest, Mr. Chairman, the witness be ordered and directed to answer that question. Chairman. You are directed to answer the question. Cook. I respectfully decline, sir, as is my privilege under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Aarons. Mr. Chairman, I respectfully suggest that concludes the staff interrogation of this witness. 15 years before this testimony, in 1941, Cook went before the National Labor Relations Board, representing a local lodge of the International Association of Machinists. The union's grievance was against the Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company, who refused to recognize them as a bargaining unit in the company's Denver repair and service garage. The counsel retained by Yellow Truck and Coach was Denver attorney Philip Van Cise, formerly a captain with the Colorado National Guard, who commanded Company K when the Guard was called out to the strike zone in 1913. And now it's time for me to read the trades to you. From the July 4, 1903 issue of Camp and Plant magazine. Camp and Plant was a weekly magazine published by Colorado Fuel and Iron's so-called sociological department from 1901 to 1904 and provided free to workers and their families living in the coal camps. It featured articles of general interest as well as those related to the coal and steel industries, poems, health tips, and news items reported out of the individual mining camps like this one. CF&I 5, Barnets 4. The Sunday game of ball between the Barnets and the CF&I was a very exciting one from start to finish, as it was nobody's game until the 9th inning, when the boys gave them a bunch of hits and demonstrated to the ball fans that they are good stickers and can get runs when they need them. June 6, 1903, Sopris. Several of our young folks went to Grey Creek Saturday night to dance. A good time was reported. T.A. Thompson won a half-mile race at Trinidad Tuesday. The purse was about $50. The Slavonic miner who had his leg broken Thursday in the mine was sent to the hospital Friday. J.W. Parks, butcher at the store here, has been transferred to some other camp. The Sopris Brass Band will give a grand ball here Saturday, May 23rd. Everybody is invited. Robert Stevenson was instantly killed in the mine here Saturday about noon. He has no relatives here and leaves no letters or papers to tell where he is from, and no information can be obtained as to whether he has any relatives or not. Deceased will be buried at Trinidad Sunday at 2 o'clock. Ed Linsky is taking a vacation on account of his health. Roy Richards of Denver is working in Mr. Linsky's place at present. Thomas Suttles, who had the end of his finger taken off at the laboratory a short time ago, had to have the entire finger amputated. Bert Lloyd was here on business Wednesday. T.A. Thompson went to Trinidad Monday on business. James McGraw of Sopris has accepted a position as coke boss at Starkville. Try some of F.X. Rickelman's homemade bologna. March 5, 1904, Rouse. N.M. Chapman of Oregon, brother of Dr. S. Chapman, has come to Rouse and will remain indefinitely. Walter Arnold, who has been deputy at Rouse for several weeks, has returned to his ranch. G.C. Quillian of Walsenburg has taken Mr. Arnold's place. Mr. Seacombe, who was superintendent at Rugby, died at his home in Denver. The causes of his death were carboniferous deposits in the lungs and the breaking down of the bronchial tubes. Mr. Goodnight will take a laundry agency from Radford and Stiles of Trinidad. This will be welcome news to the people here. The Columbine Club of Rouse gave a very enjoyable colonial tea on the eve of February 22. The members of the club appeared in dainty, quaint costumes appropriate to the occasion, the powdered hair making the faces of the ladies seem even more young and fresh than usual. A display of the basket and beadwork made by the members of the club was a source of great interest to the many guests present, the workmanship showing deft fingers had been busy at a useful and fascinating pastime. The old-fashioned games and dances proved those present had not forgotten how to enjoy the games of their youth. Segundo. The stork has been seen in this vicinity lately. A baby boy weighing 9 pounds was left at the home of William Boyle. Preparations are being made to start up the oven at Segundo. Washer number 1 was started up Saturday morning. Everyone was glad to see Mr. Stevenson, master mechanic, when he dropped in on us the other day. Mrs. Joseph Florin died as the result of blood poisoning. It will seem natural to see the oven spouting smoke once more. Mr. and Mrs. Gillespie were on the sick list last week. Bronchitis, tonsillitis, la grippe, and 1 or 2 cases of heart trouble, which always come in the springtime, are the most prominent afflictions at present. In the June 20th issue, also from 1903, Camp and Plant ran an item reporting on a sermon by Bishop Matz that had originally appeared in the Denver Catholic on June 6 of that year. The piece opens. In his sermon, preached at the Logan Avenue Chapel Sunday morning, Right Reverend Bishop N.C. Matz severely arraigned labor unions which embrace socialist doctrines, which favor sympathetic strikes, and which wage wars through unjust strikes. In the most sweeping terms, he condemned the Western Federation of Miners and the American Labor Union, both of which have declared for socialism, and called upon all good Catholics to leave unions which in any way approve the tenets of socialism. You could probably guess with some accuracy at the overall thrust of the sermon itself. I'm going to quote only the closing paragraphs, since they provide an unintentional antecedent to this episode's cold open. When Mazzini, the most celebrated Italian revolutionist and the most gifted and ardent plotter in the cause of Italy's unification under the form of an Italian republic, offered to Pius IX the presidency of said contemplated republic, Pius answered, "Non possamus, we cannot. It is an injustice because it involves the extinction and destruction by violent, unlawful means of all the principalities, dukedoms, and little kingdoms of the realm which have existed for centuries in Italy. All history goes to prove that when the revolutionary monsters, anarchists, and communists have devoured everything, they devour themselves. France in 1789 and 1870 proves this fact beyond a doubt. We want to warn the Labour Party against this unholy alliance with socialism. In the declarations made by the American Labor Union and the Western Federation of Miners, we read the handwriting on the wall. Let labor beware. It is time yet, but high time. The next few items are from the Coal and Coke Operator and Fuel magazine of Pittsburgh and Chicago. January 1, 1914. Mine explosion cost 38 lives. 38 men lost their lives in the explosion which occurred in the Vulcan coal mine at Newcastle, Colorado on December 16. The mine is the property of the Rocky Mountain Fuel Company. January 8. Miners prepare to aid man charged with murder. Miners are subscribing to a fund for the defense of Adolf Germer under indictment in Colorado for the killing of a detective. Germer, while a resident of Illinois, was one of the prominent men of the United Mine Workers. His friends believe the charges against him are false. January 15. Western producers more optimistic. Colorado conditions are reported to be gradually improving. More mines are operating now than before the holidays, and the labor situation is past the crisis, and strikers are returning to work. This next one is from the Chronicle and Comment section of Coal and Coke Operator, featuring little 1- and 2-sentence items, quote, gathered from many sources and condensed for busy readers. February 5, 1914. There are to be investigations of the underlying causes and pertinent related features of the strikes of the copper miners of Michigan and the miners in Colorado by committees of Congress. The result will probably furnish more ammunition for socialistic and anarchistic windbags and blatherskites. This last clipping is from Coal Age, the preeminent trade journal of the coal industry, still being published today. February 14, 1914. Should strikes occur? Speaking at the last winter session of the Coal Mining Institute of America, Harrington Emerson, the well-known efficiency advocate, said, "A strike seems to me not only a preventable, but a ridiculous, stupid thing like the sinking of the Titanic or the wrecks on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad." Adverse comment on this bold and perhaps largely untrue statement was made by several of those who discussed the paper. We reproduce it, however, because it is so confident that it focuses one's attention and makes one question just how much truth there is in it. We cannot overlook the fact that the United Mine Workers of America is organized for strife, and to a degree its continuance depends upon its discovering wrongs, real and fancied, for which it can demand a remedy. On the whole, however, a more enlightened spirit would demand that the Union be kept like a modern army, as insurance against oppression rather than for aggressive purposes. There are men who irk at paying life and fire insurance because the need of either is so rare. Men tire of paying union dues for the same reason, but nevertheless a prudent man will consider the best union one which protects its members without a strike, without even a suspension. The Army fulfills its purpose most successfully when it does not fire a shot. We must also remember that the object of the direct action advocates is to foment perpetual strife and arrange for a strike whenever the operator is least desirous of such an annoyance. Such people, we believe, will soon tire of the strenuous course they have marked out. In fact, there is even now a lull which seems to indicate that syndicalism has exhausted its advocates, physically, mentally, and morally. The toll of hate is heavy on its followers, deranging their digestive organs, preventing restful nights, and overthrowing their reason. Economically also, it impoverishes at least the rank and file. It cannot continue forever. Orgies of hate have arisen again and again in history, and after a period, longer or shorter, died away, not without, however, leaving grievous scars. Without meaning to contradict the thrust of that last editorial from Coal Age, certainly there were signs of weariness among strike leaders and rank and file alike by midwinter 1914, but the more visible form of attrition around Ludlow at this time was on the other side of the tracks. Company K, the unit commanded by Philip Van Cise and stationed most closely to the strikers' tent colony, was colloquially known as the College Company, composed as it was mostly of professional men with relatively lucrative trades they were anxious to get back to. Even as early as late November 1913, it was becoming clear that the quick end of the strike that was supposed to follow the calling in of the Guard was not in the cards, and men began mustering out of the militia to return to their homes and businesses. To replace them, Van Cise and other commanders in the strike zone had to recruit locally on short notice. The path of least resistance often led straight to the coal camps, where mine guards, already disposed to deal violently with mine workers, were in steady supply. Philip Van Cise shows up in the history narratives as a sort of gallant to Karl Linderfelt's Goofus. Where Linderfelt was hostile and hot-tempered, Van Cise was said to be cordial and law-abiding. He built relationships with several of the strike leaders. He told the men of Company K that the strikers had a legitimate grievance and encouraged them to fraternize with the tent colonists. Guardsmen and colonists played baseball together and jointly hosted at least one dance. Van Cise was also openly critical of the conduct of Linderfelt and other Guard officers, particularly around the events in April 1914 that we have been in slow orbit around since episode 1. His assessment of Linderfelt was that he was a, quote, murderer, a robber, and a thief, and he would later lead a military court of inquiry to determine if Linderfelt had acted criminally. After leaving the Guard, Van Cise would serve for a time as Denver District Attorney, where he built a reputation as a sort of local Elliot Ness, going after the powerful Blonger Gang and later the Ku Klux Klan, before opening the private practice that would briefly connect him to Rudy Cook in the 1940s. But however gentlemanly he did so, Van Cise did play his part. On the train from Trinidad to Ludlow in October 1913, he warned his troops, erroneously, that many of the strikers they would be contending with were Greek veterans of the Balkan War, quote, trained soldiers, heavily armed. He told them, if you have to shoot, don't waste your ammunition by firing into the air over their heads. Shoot to kill. After the strike, he summed up his thoughts by saying, quote, what the nation needs is radically amended immigration laws that will keep out anarchists and lawless inclined Italians, Greeks, and other South European people. By the end of February 1914, the United Mine Workers were hemorrhaging funds unsustainably. Despite extra union dues of 50 cents a month per member levied to cover strike costs, the union was running a deficit of around $40,000 a month, about $1.25 million in today's money, and was forced to instill austerity measures. Predictably, this led to increased tension within the organization, with District 15 officials accusing each other of living high off the hog while they starved and froze. Private detectives and moles took advantage of the growing rancor, spawning whisper campaigns to sow distrust. At the same time, the state of Colorado, tasked with paying the salaries and expenses of up to 2,000 guardsmen in the strike zone, was hardly any more solvent. Believing the occupation of the militia would bring a swift end to the strike, Governor Ammons had agreed in the fall of 1913 to borrow money from a consortium of bankers to be repaid at 6% interest to cover the guards' payroll. By February, the first installment of $150,000 was now almost gone, and Ammons didn't want to take on more debt, especially when all signs suggested that the strike would not be able to last much longer. The importation of strikebreakers, now in its third month, had been a success. Most mines in the southern field were running close to capacity. The end game seemed at hand, and on February 27, Ammons gave the order to draw down the militia to just 200 troops. On March 9th, a strikebreaker named Neil Smith was found dead on the Colorado Southern tracks, not far from the Forbes tent colony just to the south of Ludlow. A railroad crew testified that he had stumbled there on a drunken walk, but their testimony was not considered by the coroner's jury, who ruled the case a murder, which investigators claimed they traced back to the Forbes colony. It's not impossible that Smith was lynched by colonists from Forbes, but coroner's juries in Los Animas County were notorious for being stacked by the sheriff to secure the verdict the coal companies wanted, particularly when it came to assigning fault for deaths in the mines. Immediately, all the adult males from Forbes were arrested as part of the investigation, 16 in all. The next day, a cavalry detachment tore down all the tents at Forbes, save one. When the soldiers arrived, they found the colony empty except for Emma Zanatelli and another unnamed woman who'd been left to keep her company while the other women were away, burying Emma's 2 infants, who had been stillborn 2 days earlier. It's likely the babies would have been born safely if the doctor could have arrived sooner, but he had to abandon his car after getting shot at by sheriff's deputies as he tried to approach the colony, and ended up having to crawl the rest of the way there through an arroyo. This was the second time in Emma's life that soldiers came to destroy her home in the midst of a labor struggle. Late in life, she would relate the childhood memory of being carried in her mother's arms as the family fled their home in Sopris just before it was dynamited by agents from Colorado Fuel and Iron during the Great Marching Strike of 1894. When United Mine Workers President John White learned that the destruction of the Forbes colony had been directly ordered by General Chase to, quote, forestall future outlawry, he wrote in a telegram to the governor that, quote, it scarcely seems possible that such outrages can be permitted on American soil. These tents are our property, located on our land, occupied by miners who have been thrown out of company houses. We protest such inhuman methods and call upon you to stop perpetration of such outrages by military authorities. When the men of Forbes were released from prison, they returned home and began to erect the tents the militia had felled. Carl Linderfelt promptly arrived with a mounted unit to tear them down again, and to emphasize the point, they remained camped on the site with fixed bayonets. The Colorado Attorney General, Fred Farrar, no particular friend to labor, affirmed the soundness of President White's argument. The Forbes colony was on rented land, and the Union had every right under the law to pitch their tents there undisturbed. But on March 25th, when John Lawson and John McClellan went out with another group to set up the tents again, the militia promptly arrived to dissuade them. Forbes was no more. When the Trinidad Free Press reported on the destruction of the colony, they asked, will Ludlow be the next to suffer? Effigy is written, produced, and read to you by Chris Schoen. This episode's cold open was read by Emmy Bean. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to help ensure it continues, the best way to do that is to share an episode with people you think might like it, or to post about it on social media. If you prefer to make an impact anonymously, by all means, please give the show a nice 5-star rating under the protection of a mysterious username. The episode you've just listened to is a free episode, and that's because each episode in Season 1 is completely free with no paywall and no ads. But nonetheless, if you are able, I hope you can subscribe to the show on Patreon at patreon.com/effigypod. You'll be helping me make the show more excellent and helping me spend more time doing what I would like to be doing with my time here on planet Earth. It doesn't cost much. Tiers start at just $3 a month. You can write to the show at effigypod@gmail.com, and you are encouraged to do so. You can also follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky by searching for the handle effigypod, or you can visit the podcast website, effigypod.com, which has all the social media handles, plus show transcripts, a bibliography, and a very nice picture of mules. Thank you very much for listening. Till next time, bella ciao.